Today's daf is daf Mem Beis, and we got up to Tanya Idach. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines down from the top. And we're talking about the pasuk Ubal Ashar Naki, and we're trying to figure out exactly what we derive from this pasuk. And now we're going to study Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Tanya Idach, Bal Ashar Naki, Rabbi Yossi Aglili Omer Naki mitmei v'lodos. So we're talking about a case where two men were in a brawl, and one of them, instead of hitting his friend, he hit a woman. And she was pregnant, and as a result of the bang, she miscarried. And the pasuk is coming to tell me, according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, that if a shor tam was nogeach, and you would think that therefore the shor tam pays chatzi nezek, as it does if it damages a person, but in the case where it attacks a human being, it's potur from dmei v'lodos, meaning chatzi dmei v'lodos. Now here, the pasuk says in Shmos Chaf Aleph, "V'chiyinotzu anoshim." So two men are fighting one against the other. V'nogfu isha hara, and they hit a pregnant woman. V'yotzi yoladeha, and the pasuk adds, and this is going to be very important for today's daf, "V'lo yeh ason," meaning she did not die, she lost the v'lodos. Anosh ye anosh, then he who hit this woman and caused the unfortunate miscarriage, he will be punished, kasher yoshis olav bala isha, which means that he's going to have to pay dmei v'lodos. Rabbi Yossi Aglili maintains that it says in the pasuk Bal Ashar Naki to teach us that this din only applies in a case of a man who hits a woman and the v'lodos are lost. But if a shor hits a woman and the v'lodos are lost, then there's no chiyuv of chatzi dmei v'lodos, despite the fact that it's a shor tam, who normally would pay chatzi nezek. Amala Rabbi Akiva, and this statement of Rabbi Akiva again is going to occupy us for the entire daf. Why do you, Rabbi Yossi Aglili, need the pasuk? Hareu Omer, with regard to Dmei V'lodos, it says ki notzu anoshim. So the Torah emphasizes the word anoshim, and that's coming to be mamayit anoshim v'lo shvarim, that there's no chiyuv Dmei V'lodos unless it was an ish that hit this woman. But if a shor hits this woman, then there's no Dmei V'lodos. So the Torah went out of its way to be mamayit Dmei V'lodos in the case of a shor that hits a pregnant woman. Why do you need, therefore, the pasuk of Naki? And the Gemara asks, Shapir Ka'amar Rabbi Kiva, how do we defend Rabbi Yossi Aglili? Amar Rav Ula Bereid Rav Idi Itzrach. Rabbi Yossi Aglili argues that we still need the pasuk Naki to generate a ptur of Dmei V'lodos. It's not enough to derive from the miyud of anoshim. Salka dait chamin, I would have thought. That which the Torah is memayit excludes through the word anoshim v'lo shvarim, that means shvarim hadomim la'anoshim. Now, the strange phrase here of shvarim hadomim la'anoshim. What does that mean? An Adam, when he's mazik, he's considered like a muad, because Adam muad liolam. And that was a Gemara that we derived back on Daf Chavav, that when a human being is responsible for hezek, he's always considered a muad. And therefore, we're going to assume that we're looking for shvarim to exclude through the miyud of anoshim that is similar to anoshim. Af shvarim b'muadim. that in the case of a shar muad that knocks out and kills the vlados, there's no chiyuv of dmei vlados. But that's because the shar is a shar muad, and it's dumya da noshim, which is by definition muad. Ha-tam. However, in the case of tam, there will be a chiyuv of dmei vlados, because the miut from tashlumei dmei vlados only applies to a muad. And this is one of those weird cases, and we've seen them before, where we're being more machmir in a tam than in a muad, which is counterintuitive. And therefore, kosav rachmana balashar noki the potter, to exclude this havamina, that the only miut of anoshim is to exclude shvarim adumim de anoshim, which means muad, but a shar tam would pay dmei vlados, we needed the pasuk balashar noki. Omar Rava says yatziva bi'ara v'giyora v'shmei shmaya, which is an idiomatic phrase to express the idea that this is impossible. Meaning, if, let's say, a citizen who lives in a certain country is down on the earth, and then the arrow is up in Shamayim. Now, Giora here, which normally means an arrow, is interpreted in this case by the Sefer HaAruch, one of the Gaonim, as referring to a ger. So the word Giora here is Aramaic for ger. And if a person is a citizen, a local citizen, he's down here on earth, and now you're telling me that a ger, who is just a sojourner, he's got what we used to call in my youth a green card, but he's not a permanent citizen of that country, he's going to go all the way up to Shammai, meaning he's on a higher level than a citizen who has a passport, who has a Tudat Zahut. In other words, it's impossible to argue that a shara muad is potter from Dmei Vlados when he's nogeach, a pregnant woman, whereas a shar tam, who doesn't normally attack, he's not a belligerent, proven, established animal, should be chayiv Dmei Vlados, as if to say that there was a havamina, that the miut of tashlumei Dmei Vlados, based on anoshim v'lo shvarim, is only going to exclude a shar muad, but not a shar tam. How could it be? Ella Amar Rav. So we move on from the interpretation of Rabbi Yossi Aglili of Ula, Rav Ula, to that of Rav. We're going to have a number of possible interpretations to answer the question why Rabbi Yossi Aglili could not derive his conclusion that a shar tam that was nogeach, a pregnant woman, does not have to pay chatzi dmei vlados from Bala Sharnaki, and he didn't want to derive it from Anoshim. Itzrich, says Rava, why do I need this pasuk Naki to pater up dmei vlados? And it's not enough to derive from Anoshim. If you only had the drasha, the miut of Anoshim v'lo shvarim hadomim la'anoshim. Again, the domim la'anoshim we've seen already in Rabbi Ula, but Rava suggests an alternative dome la'anoshim, not the dome la'anoshim of adam muad li'olam, but rather ma'anoshim muadim af shvarim muadim v'kal v'chomer de tamin de p'tirei. So that Rava's logic is going to be that even in a case of a shor muad, there's going to be a p'tur of dmei vlados. Why? Because the Torah in the pasuk Anoshim is implying that in the case of a shor muad, who's dumya d'anoshim, he's excluded from the pasuk Anoshim v'lo shvarim. And therefore, we would come to the conclusion, the mistaken conclusion, that in a case of a shar muad, there's no chiyuv of dmei vlados because of the miut of anoshim. and a shor muad is dumya da'anoshim. Therefore, Hadar Kasar Rachmana, now I know why the Pasuk had to add Bala Sharnaki to teach me that Tam is Potter, not because I would have really had a Havamina that Tam is Potter, but rather to tell me that a Muad is Chayev. And why would I have a Havamina that Muad is Potter based on the Pasuk Anoshim, the Miyad of Anoshim? So what's very strange about Rava is that the Torah, in a certain sense, misled us by adding the word anoshim as a miut to exclude dumya da anoshim, namely muadim, and then turn around with the pasuk bal sharnaki to say that a tam is potter, the muad is chayev. It's like lomi duvshach lomi uktzach. Instead of misleading us with anoshim, so he writes the following, based on Rashi and Tosfos Rabbeinu Peretz, Klomar, Naki Polalamid Shalom Nomar Shemiyut Shvarim Hu Bishvarimu Odom Adomim La Noshim Elabetam Dafka. In other words, I need the pasuk Naki to shed a light on the word Anoshim and split the word Anoshim in its exclusion of Shvarim into two, meaning to apply the exclusion to a shartam, and the case of mu'adim is dumya danoshim, and therefore it's chayev. He says, "Lefi zeh ein amid noki bol lamed aptur b'tam." I don't need the pasuk according to Rava noki to pater up a tam, because I already have the pasuk anoshim to pater up a shor, and I would have assumed that certainly with a kal v'chomer it would exclude a chiv tashlumei tmei flodos in the case of a shor tam. But rather the pasuk of Bala Shor Naki is coming to be mechayev a shor muad, and to tell me that the pasuk anoshim is excluding only a shor tam and not a shor muad, and if a shor muad pays tmei flodos. Amalei Abaye Elameata. If that's what your drasha is regarding Tmei Vlados, is Gabi Boshes Nami, Nema Hachi. Why don't we apply the same yardstick to the case of Boshes? Because in the Parsha, in Ki Teitze, Dvarim Chafei, it says Ki Notzu Anoshim, and we use the word Anoshim to exclude Shvarim, and we're going to darshan that since you had a svara to say that anoshim v'lo shvarim adomim le'anoshim anoshim muadim ashvarim muadim, and therefore you can exclude a shor muad whose domyad anoshim from the chiv boshes is kal v'chomer l'tam de p'tiri, and how much more so a tam, which is more kal than a muad, is potter from boshes. And therefore, Hadar Kasar Rachmana Bala Sharnaki, once again, we should apply Rava's structure that the Bala Sharnaki is coming to tell us that Dafka Tam Potter Miboshes, but Muad is Chayev. Okay, that sounds good. Why then does Abai attack Rava? Abai is only showing you that if we apply Rava's methodological drushes of comparing Anoshim to Bala Sharnaki consistently to the case of Boshes, which again, we said many times in the past that Chovel B'Adam is Chai B'Arba Dvarim. And that's only in the case of Adam Shechovel. Shor Shechovel is Potter B'Chol Arba. It's Potter from Tsar because the Torah says Ish, Ki Yitain Mumba Mito, and Ish V'lo Shor. It's Potter from Ripui V'Sheves because it says Kimishpat Hazeh. Rabbi Akiva derives it from Ish Ba Mito. Boshes in the pasuk of Kinotzu Anoshim Yachdav. Ish Ve'achiv Ve'karva Eishes Echad Lahatzil Isha Miyad Makeh V'sholcha Yoda V'chzika Mevushal. And the Gemara dashens Anoshim V'lo Shvarim. So the Gemara says, okay, so Rabbi, what's your problem? V'chitei malchinami. Why not say that's exactly so? The Rabbi Yosef Glili would darshan exactly the way you presented it, Abaye, by logically deriving the application of Rava's drasha, and will apply to Boshas as well. And the Gemara says, Hachi, if the Brisa really held that Ubala Sharnoki is excluding not only Tashlume Dmei Vlados, Chatzi Nezik, but also it's coming to exclude Boshes, is then the Brisa should have mentioned that. It says Ubala Sharnoki Rabbi Yossi Aglili Omer Potter Mi Dmei Vlados. It doesn't add the word of Mi Boshes. So from the fact that the Brisa, in a very obvious way, ignored or omitted Boshes, we see clearly that according to Rabbi Yosef Glili, as far as the Chiyuv Boshes is concerned, there would be a Chiyuv Boshes. Otherwise, Rabbi Yosef Glili should have excluded a Tashlum not only for Dmei Vlados, but also from Boshes. Now, Rava, together with Abaye, and in the aftermath of Abaye's objection to Rava, come up with another possibility, the Amrit Shavayu. The reason, again, to answer the question why Rabbi Yosef Glili needs the drosh of Noki to patter up a shar tam from Chatzi Dmei Vlados, and it's not enough to derive from Anoshim. That's because the din of Dmei Vlados only applies if the Isha survives the blow. If she dies from the blow, then we apply the principle of Kim Lebi the Rabmine, and there's no Chiyuv Dmei Vlados. So we would have room to assume that when the Torah in the Pasuk Anoshim excluded Shvarim, it's only Anoshim of Ein Ason Be'isha, where the woman survives. Because again, the whole parsha of Dmei Vlados only applies if she survives. And then Yeyonshu, and then the Makeh will pay Dmei Vlados. But Yesh Ason Be'isha lo Yeyonsu. There's no onesh in the case where she dies, because as we said before, once the Makeh who dealt a death blow to the woman is chayiv misa, therefore he doesn't pay for Dmei Vlados, because the Kim Levi the Rabmin. But v'lo shvarim, and now the pasuk Anoshim is coming to exclude shvarim. And what's it telling you about shvarim? The afal gav the yesh also yeonshu, that the ptur in the case of Anoshim, if a man who hits a woman and she dies, that ptur does not apply in the case of shvarim. Because if the shvarim attacks a woman and she's mapelas vlados, even if she dies, nevertheless there's no chiyuv misa here. So therefore we could not possibly apply the principle of meaning and therefore in the case of a shar, even in the scenario where she dies as a result of the blow of the attack of the shar, there would be a chiyuv to made vlados. That's why Rabbi Yosef Glili needs the pasuk balashar naki to teach you that there's a ptor of a shar b'dmei vlados. Because we would have thought that adarabah, there's a chiyuv of tashlumei dmei vlados in the case of shar, even if the woman dies as a result of the attack, because there's no kim levi the rabbin. Now here, in the Masechet, in the footnote, he quotes the Tosas Rid, that Rabbi Yosef Glili, in this entire sugya, is coming to pater only a tam and not a muad. And when the Mishnah says, later on, we didn't get to it on Daf Memches, that a shor is poter midvei vlados, which seems to imply even a muad, that's not Rabbi Yosef Glili. Rabbi Yosef Glili holds that a shor muad is chayav dmei vlados, only a shor tam is excluded. That's the shita of the Tosas Rid. Maskif lo Rav Adavar Ava Now Rav Ado is going to undermine and disprove the interpretation of Abaye and Rava. Atu be'ason talya bilsa. When the Torah says that there's a ptur of Dmei Velados in event that the woman dies from this blow, does it really depend upon whether she dies or survives? And if she dies, then there's an absolute ptur. If she survives, there's an absolute chiyuv. No. Says Rav Ada bar Rava, that's a mistake. The very premise that underlies the interpretation of Abaye Rav is incorrect. B'kavana talya milsa. Everything depends upon what the intention was of the maked, the one who dealt this woman a blow. Was his kavana for the isha, and then she died, and therefore he's potter from Vei Vlados. But in a case where he did not have intention of killing the isha, he tried to kill his friend, then he's chayav Dmei Vlados, even though she dies. So you see that it's not shayach to say the way Abaye and Rava said it, that Anoshim, we would darshan that only Anoshim is a distinction between whether she survives or dies. Because even in the case of Anoshim, there's no such distinction. Whether she dies or she survives, there will be a chiyuv of Dmei Velados. And therefore the drush of Anoshim, to exclude Shvarim, we have no choice but to assume it's telling you that Shvarim are Pturim. And once again, therefore, we swing back to our original kasha. Why did Rabbi Yosef Glili need Bala Sharnoki? Elo Amar Rav Ado bar Ava. Why is it that Rabbi Yossi could not derive his conclusion of a Ptur and Dmei Velados from Anoshim, and he needs Bala Sharnoki? Because Anoshim kinis kavnu zelozeh, afal gav sheish osam v'isha yei onshe. In the case where a man tried to kill his friend in that brawl, he had no intention whatsoever of killing the isha, even though she dies. There will still be a chiyuv tashlume dmei velados, even though she died. Why? Because we are holding now that if a person had kavanah to kill Reuven and instead he killed Shimon, that he's not chayev. And basically, he's not a murderer, he's not guilty, and therefore, even though she died, it's not considered as if he was the murderer who killed her, because it was niskavnu zelazeh, and there was no kavanah to kill the woman. And then we apply the pasuk. And then we don't apply the pasuk of lo yeh onesh, but rather we say, you know what? He has to pay Dmei Velados. But when he becomes a murderer, ki niskavnu leisha atzma, I shouldn't say they, because it was one of the two. Let's say Reuven was fighting with Shimon, and Reuven dealt a deliberate death blow to a woman, and she lost her velados, is lo yeyanshu. Since there's a chiyuv misa as a rotzeach when he had kavanah for the isha, therefore there's no onish of Dmei Velados. And now we're going to interpret the miyut of anoshim velo shvarim, and it means that in the case of shvarim there would be an onesh afilu is kavno leisha atzma, even if the shor had a direct attack with an intention to kill this woman, ye anshu, because again, as we said before, there's no chiyuv misa, even though she died, because it's the shor that killed her, and even though the shor had intention to kill her, or shall we say it matters not whether the shor had intention or didn't have intention, in all cases, the bala shor she has to pay Dmei Velados. So the entire distinction of Anoshim, which is going to tell me that if he had kavanah to kill this woman, he doesn't pay Dmei Velados, that whole distinction doesn't apply in the case of a shar. And in shar, in all cases, even if he had kavana to the isha, you pay dmei vlados, and therefore kosav rachmana balashar naki the petire. We need therefore the pasuk. V'chein ki asa Rab Chagai midaroma asa v'aisim asnisa b'yodei. Rab Chagai brought a brisa kavasi de Rav Abba, de Rav Ada bar Ava, that interprets Rab Yossi Aglili in the same way that Rav Ada bar Ava interprets it, that it doesn't say anoshim to exclude a shar, and there would always be a chiyuv d'mei vlados, even if the shar had kavanah to kill the woman, and that's why I need ubala shar noki. Tanya idach, we have another brisa that has a different drasha in the name of Rabbi Akiva for bala shar noki. Bala shar noki, Rabbi Akiva omer noki midvei eved. We're talking about a case where the shar killed an eved. The Torah says in such a case that the Baal Ashar has to pay a knas, a penalty of shloshim shkolim. What happens in the case where it's not the Adon who killed the Eved, but rather it's his Shar who killed the Eved? And the Shar was a Shar Tam that attacked the Eved and killed the Eved. The Baal Ashar does not pay shloshim shkolim shel Eved. The Torah was machayev a shara muad that kills an eved to pay the baal and pay shloshim shkol, but not a shar tam. And here we turn to daf men beis amud beis.